Amen. Please be seated. During the battle for Britain, Josephine Baker worked in the Royal Air Force at the airport. One of her jobs, was to sit on the tail of a Spitfire aircraft when they were taking off to go and fight the Germans as they crossed the pond. It's hard to believe, but the winds were so strong as they took off there close to the ocean that it was hard for the planes to stay stable. So Josephine and other women like her would lay on the tail of the aircraft. Just before takeoff, the pilots would slow down, they would jump off the tail, they would take off. Well, one morning there was a quick alarm, and Josephine was called out to her aircraft. She sat on the back, but the sergeant forgot to give the pilot the signal that there was someone sitting on the tail of his plane. He took off, he sped up down the runway, he didn't slow down, and he took off over the English Channel. Josephine did all she knew to do, which was to flop over the tail of the aircraft and hope that the wind would hold her onto the plane. When the pilot noticed that his tail was heavy and he was having trouble maneuvering, he realized he had someone sitting on his plane. So he made a quick loop around, landed the plane, and Josephine got off. Unfortunately, she was fined for losing her hat during the flight. But when they asked her if she was okay, she said, "Yes, I just need a cigarette and a change of underwear, and I'll be ready to go again." So how do we respond when something doesn't go according to plan? Put yourself in Joseph and Mary's shoes. God changed everything about your life. Marriage plans change, family plans change, life plans change, but you make it to Bethlehem. And the baby is born healthy and happy despite this long trip, despite being born in a manger. And after 2 years, tradition tells us at this point in the story, Jesus is 2 years, you still find yourself in Bethlehem. Shepherds have come to see your son and have told the story of angels. Wise men have come from the east, magi, and bringing gifts, and they tell you they followed a star to find you. God is doing something. God is clearly doing something. And you are building a new life in your family's ancestral home, and everything seems great. And then suddenly you hear, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt. Herod wants to destroy your child." The king of Israel is after your toddler. And you have to go to, of all places, Egypt. Egypt. Think about what Egypt represents to the Jewish people. Could we choose a worse place? Why not Samaria? Why send the future king there? It seems like God has a plan, God is doing something, and then everything falls apart. As a father myself, I can't help but hear this story from Joseph's perspective. He's raised Jesus as his own for possibly as long as 2 years. He's attached now. This is his son. And now he is put in the position where he needs to save his son's life from an evil tyrant who commands an army. It's natural to feel the need to protect your loved ones and your family and your children. But when they're young, that instinct is a lot stronger, isn't it? I mean, when they're teenagers, we're like, it's okay if they get a little hurt. They'll learn from it, right? But when they're young, you just want to protect them. I remember when I was in seminary, my children were very young, 2 and 4. And I was sitting in class one day, and my classmates were talking about the Yellowstone supervolcano. And I said, "The Yellowstone what?" Yeah, the supervolcano, the largest pool of lava in the world that's underneath Yellowstone, and how geysers are starting to erupt more and more, and some scientists think any day now, and by any day they mean any 1,000 years now, that could erupt. And I thought, oh, surely this is just a fake news, conspiracy theory. I researched it. Nope. Seems to be a real thing. And if it erupted, there would be no habitable place in North America. Maybe if you're on the other side of the world, you might get lucky enough to survive the long 10-year winter that's coming afterwards. And I remember laying awake at night thinking, how could I protect my kids if something like that happened? And my conclusion was, I couldn't. And how many times do we face those moments in our life? It's apparent from our reading that Joseph still believes, despite all appearances at this moment, that God has a plan and God is faithful. And he responds accordingly. And this Joseph reminds me of another Joseph, and I think the gospel intends us to be reminded of this other Joseph. This Joseph was the favorite son of a wealthy man, and life was good. And his brothers turn on him. They sell him into slavery. But he's bought by a man named Potiphar. And soon he is the head of Potiphar's house, the head of a wealthy man's estate in Egypt. And everything seems to be going well despite all that has happened. But then a lie is told about Joseph, and he finds himself in jail and forgotten again. If I was Joseph at this point, I would give up. I would just wait for death. But Joseph doesn't know the word quit. And we all know the story. He eventually finds himself in Pharaoh's house. He eventually is leading Pharaoh's house. And in every instance, when everything around him is falling apart, Joseph believed God was faithful. He believed God would not forget him. And because of Joseph's attitude and what he did and how he responded, his family and the Jewish people were saved during a famine. So this morning there are two things I want to say. And the first is this. When it seems like the world around you is falling apart, when it seems like all of your plans and all of the plans you thought God had for you have fallen apart, don't assume that God is done with you. For good or bad, we each have free will. And people like Herod are free to cause pain and misery. But we also have the freedom to choose how we will respond, like Joseph and like Joseph. And it's tempting for us when the people around us are acting poorly, when they're acting with violence or injustice or just terribly. It's tempting for us to respond in kind, to use their bad behavior as an excuse for us to act poorly, to cast aside our integrity, to use pain as an excuse to give up on our faith, on each other, on God. And I think that's natural. It's understandable. But thank God that Joseph didn't think that way. Thank God that Joseph and Mary didn't respond that way. You see, as far as I know, no one here can tell the future. None of us knows what the future will bring and what God can do with all of the garbage we might have gone through. I can't imagine our nation without an Abraham Lincoln who for the first 50 years of his life thought he was a miserable, abject failure. I can't imagine our nation without an Abraham Lincoln who knew what it was like to lose his own son as he sent other sons off to fight. He knew the necessity of forgiveness and reconciliation after conflict, and I wonder if our nation would not be more unified today and not facing some of the same divisions if he had lived and his plan to rebuild the shattered South hadn't been implemented. I can't imagine what the world would be like without a Franklin Roosevelt who had polio and had to learn how to live again despite paralysis. I can't imagine what our world would look like without a Winston Churchill who lost his father at a young age, who was told he would die at a young age. So when he was old and sitting in Parliament, believed he was washed up and done and finished and just living on borrowed time. So he might as well just say what he thought about that little angry German across the sea and say it as loud as he could. You see, history is full of stories of people like Joseph and Mary, like Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Rosa Parks, Dorothy Day, Florence Nightingale, who go through pain and experience loss and witness terrible tragedy, and yet they somehow find a way to turn that loss into salvation for others. And this leads me to the second thing we need to hear on this second Sunday of Christmas. This season teaches us that when the world seems like it's falling apart, remember, God, through Christ, has been there. Today we heard how Joseph saved Jesus against all odds. And yet we remember that Jesus still died at the hands of a power-hungry man like Herod. And the same will be true of us. As the psalmist says, all flesh is as grass. None of us is getting out of this alive. And so the question is, despite our best efforts to deny pain and upheaval and death in our culture, they're a part of our lives. So what will we do with the time and the circumstances we're given? I think the story of Christmas and the gospel we hear today tells us, first, that God knows and understands our pain because God became flesh and dwelt among us. So may we live with integrity. May we live with faithfulness, no matter what happens around us.